On a morning of July 13th, 2025, a room with no ceiling looked out over the oldest exposed rock on Earth. The walls were still standing, massive pillars of Kaibab limestone quarried from the canyon itself. But the roof was gone, the ponderosa beams were ash, and the steel skeleton of what had been the Grand Canyon Lodge stood naked against the Arizona sky like the ribs of something enormous that had finally died. That room had been called the Sun Room. For 88 years, visitors had walked into it and gasped, because the architect had designed the windows to frame the canyon so precisely that the building itself disappeared, and all you saw was the void. Gilbert Stanley Underwood had understood something most builders never grasp. The greatest thing you can do with architecture is make people forget they're inside a building. Now the building had obliged him permanently. It was gone. The fire that killed the Grand Canyon Lodge was called the Dragon Bravo Fire. It started on the 4th of July, lightning, not fireworks, on the North Rim, the higher, quieter, lonelier side of the canyon that only about 10% of visitors ever bother to reach. By the time it burned itself out at the end of September, it had consumed 145,000 acres and 113 structures, including the lodge, the visitor center, the wastewater treatment plant, dozens of guest cabins, and employee housing for 200 workers. The fire suppression bill came to $135 million. One person died. The North Rim closed entirely for the rest of 2025 and reopened in May 2026 with no lodge, no running water, and no overnight accommodations inside the park. Here is the part that nobody talks about. This was the second time the Grand Canyon Lodge burned down. The first time was September 1st, 1932. To understand how that lodge got there in the first place, you have to understand a railroad rivalry. By the 1920s, the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company had locked up the South Rim, the El Tovar, the Bright Angel Lodge site, the concession rights, the 65-mile spur line from Williams. The Union Pacific, arriving late and unable to compete on the South Rim, made a flanking move. It formed the Utah Parks Company and staked its claim on the North Rim instead. The North Rim sits 1,000 feet higher than the South, receives more rain and snow, is blanketed in ponderosa pine and spruce rather than the South Rim's high desert, and is, critically, far more difficult to reach. No direct railroad connection to the North Rim was ever established. The closest Union Pacific station was on the main line at Cedar City, Utah, 160 miles to the northwest. From there, the company graded a road and ran motor coaches to the rim. The remoteness was the point. The Union Pacific was selling solitude, altitude, and exclusivity, the opposite of the South Rim's growing bustle. It hired Gilbert Stanley Underwood, the same architect who had designed its lodges at Bryce Canyon and Zion, and gave him Bright Angel Point, one of the most dramatic promontories on the canyon's edge. The lodge complex opened on June 1st, 1928, with room for 250 guests in the main building and 120 cabins. When visitors arrived, the entire staff lined up at the door to greet them. When they left, the staff sang. The original lodge, Underwood's full vision, with a second story, an observation tower, enormous interior spaces of timber and stone, caught fire on September 1st, 1932, from sparks thrown by one of its own hearths. 25 young women asleep in a dormitory wing escaped. The building did not. The Utah Parks Company vowed to rebuild even as the Great Depression tightened around the country. They put up a temporary lodge in 1933, brought Underwood back in 1936, and by 1937 had a new structure on the old footprint, using much of the original stonework but scaled down. No second story, no observation tower. That was the lodge that stood for 88 more years, until the Dragon Bravo fire found it on a night of 40-mile-per-hour winds and took it apart in hours. Two fires, 93 years apart, same spot on the edge of the same abyss. The canyon itself is roughly 6 million years old, depending on which geologist you ask and which part of the canyon they're measuring. The rock at the bottom, Vishnu Schist, the dark, twisted basement of the continent, is close to 2 billion years. Against that timescale, the entire human project at the Grand Canyon is a flicker. The railroads, the lodges, the mule trains, the pipelines, the parking lots, the shuttle buses, the 5 million annual visitors, the $900 million a year they spend, all of it happening in the geological equivalent of a single breath. And yet it was that flicker of human ambition, that century-long attempt to build something worthy of the canyon, that made the Grand Canyon what it became. Not just a hole in the ground, but a destination. A place with hotels and gift shops and dining rooms and architects and Harvey girls and presidents eating breakfast at the rim. The story of nobody wanting to visit the Grand Canyon anymore is not really about the canyon. The canyon is fine. The canyon will be fine long after every road and building has crumbled into it. The story is about everything humans built around the canyon and what happens when you stop maintaining it. The human story at the Grand Canyon begins in the modern sense with a railroad spur. In 1901, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway completed a 65-mile branch line running from Williams, Arizona, up to the South Rim. Before that, tourists reached the canyon by stagecoach from Flagstaff, a bone-rattling $20 three-day ordeal that only the determined or the wealthy would tolerate. The railroad changed the math overnight. Suddenly, you could leave Williams in the morning and be standing at the edge of creation by lunch. The Fred Harvey Company, which had already built a chain of hotels and restaurants along the Santa Fe main line that turned rail travel in the American West from an endurance test into a pleasure, saw the opportunity immediately. They hired a Chicago architect named Charles Whittlesey, the Santa Fe's chief architect, and gave him $250,000 to build a hotel at the terminus. The Al Tovar opened on January 14, 1905, 14 years before Arizona was even a state, 19 years before the canyon became a national park. Whittlesey designed it as a cross between a Swiss chalet and a Norwegian hunting lodge, built from local limestone and Oregon pine, with 95 rooms, each outfitted with plumbing, steam heat, and electric lights powered by the hotel's own steam generator. Fresh water arrived by railroad tank car from a town called Del Rio, 120 miles away. The dining room served meals on china with silver service. The kitchen maintained a greenhouse and a dairy herd, and the guest list eventually included Theodore Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Zane Grey, and Calvin Coolidge. Many people called it the most elegant hotel west of the Mississippi, and in 1905, they were probably right. The Al Tovar is the building that explains everything that came after. It proved that you could make serious money at the edge of a canyon in the middle of nowhere. Not mining money, not ranching money, but hospitality money, tourism money. The kind of money that depends not on what's in the ground, but on what people are willing to pay to look at what's in the ground. Early residents of the area had figured this out the hard way. Mining claims in the canyon mostly failed, and the ones that produced, copper, asbestos, a smattering of other minerals, never matched the money that tourism brought in. Before the El Tovar, a few rough lodges and tent camps served visitors who arrived by stagecoach. Pete Berry ran a hotel near his copper mine. Ralph Cameron, who would later become a U.S. Senator, controlled the Bright Angel Trail and charged $1 toll to anyone who wanted to use it. The trail remained a private toll road until 1928, when the Park Service finally acquired it. That is the kind of place the Grand Canyon was before the federal government took control. A landscape of competing claims, private toll roads, and entrepreneurs who understood that the view was worth more than the ore. Theodore Roosevelt visited in 1903, 2 years before the hotel opened, and said the thing every schoolchild learns: do nothing to mar its grandeur. Keep it for your children and your children's children, the one great sight every American should see. By 1908, he had declared it a national monument, By 1919, Woodrow Wilson signed it into a national park. 44,000 people visited that first year. By the mid-1920s, something had shifted. In the 1925 to 26 travel season, visitors arriving by automobile, 72,500, outnumbered those arriving by train for the first time. The car had begun to win. By 1929, total visitation had risen to 184,000, a five-fold increase in a decade. The strain was already visible. Park employees lived in ramshackle buildings. Unfettered livestock wandered the South Rim. The infrastructure that the railroads had built was designed for a trickle of well-heeled train passengers, not a flood of middle-class families in Model A Fords. On June 30th, 1956, the Grand Canyon entered the national consciousness in a way that had nothing to do with scenery. A TWA Super Constellation and a United Airlines DC-7, both flying over the canyon on transcontinental routes, collided in midair at 21,000 feet. All 128 people aboard both planes died. Wreckage fell into the canyon itself, into the Temple Butte and Chuar Butte areas, so remote that recovery crews needed helicopters and mule trains to reach the debris. It was the deadliest aviation disaster in American history at the time, and it exposed the fact that commercial airplanes were flying through uncontrolled airspace with no radar coverage. The crash led directly to the creation of the Federal Aviation Administration in 1958. The Grand Canyon, a place defined by its permanence, had become the site of a catastrophe that changed how Americans fly. A small memorial sits in the Canyon View Cemetery on the South Rim, where 67 unidentified victims are buried. But the real genius of the early Grand Canyon was not Roosevelt, and it was not Whittlesey. It was a woman from Pittsburgh named Mary Elizabeth Jane Colter, and she is the reason the South Rim of the Grand Canyon looks the way it does today. Colter arrived at the Grand Canyon in 1904, hired by the Fred Harvey Company to design a gift shop across from the El Tovar. She was 35 years old, a former art teacher from St. Paul, Minnesota, one of the only female architects working in America. And she had an idea that was radical for 1904. Instead of building European-style buildings at the edge of an ancient American landscape, she would design structures that looked like they had grown out of the canyon itself. Hopi House, her first Grand Canyon building, opened in 1905. It was modeled on a traditional Hopi Pueblo dwelling, built of sandstone and juniper by Hopi craftsmen she had recruited from nearby villages. Inside, Hopi artists lived and worked, selling their crafts to tourists who had come west expecting wilderness and found instead an architecture of place, buildings that belonged where they stood. Over the next 3 decades, Colter designed 7 more structures at the Grand Canyon, each one a masterpiece of what would come to be called National Park Service rustic architecture. Hermit's Rest in 1914, a stone grotto at the end of a rim road that looked like it had been built by a hermit a century before Colter was born. Lookout Studio, also 1914, perched so perfectly on a promontory that you cannot tell where the canyon ends and the building begins. Phantom Ranch, 1922, at the very bottom of the canyon, a cluster of stone and wood cabins accessible only by mule, on foot, or by raft. Every scrap of building material except the rock itself, hauled down by pack animal. When Fred Harvey executives told her the cabins would be called Roosevelt Chalets, Colter snatched up her blueprints and declared that if they used her work, they would use her name, Phantom Ranch, after Phantom Creek and Phantom Canyon. They used her name. The Desert View Watchtower in 1932, her most ambitious building, a 70-foot stone tower at the eastern edge of the South Rim, designed to echo the ancient watchtowers of the ancestral Puebloans, with interior murals painted by a Hopi artist named Fred Cabotier. And Bright Angel Lodge in 1935, her answer to the Depression, a log and stone lodge built as an affordable alternative to the El Tovar, 5 minutes' walk away. 4 of Colter's buildings were declared National Historic Landmarks in 1987. She had died in 1958 at 88, largely forgotten, an irascible perfectionist who wore silver rings on every finger and whose greatest achievement was designing buildings that made people forget there was an architect. Her buildings are still standing. They are today among the most valuable cultural assets in the entire national park system. They are also today in a park with a deferred maintenance backlog estimated at $330 million. That number, $330 million, is the Grand Canyon's share of a much larger problem. Across all 433 units of the National Park System, the deferred maintenance backlog stood at $24 billion at the end of fiscal year 2025. That is not a typo. $24 billion. It has been growing, essentially without pause, for decades. The Great American Outdoors Act of 2020 created a fund that provided up to $1.9 billion a year for deferred maintenance. But even that historic investment barely dented the total. The backlog actually grew from $14.9 billion in 2020 to $23.3 billion in 2023, a fact that caused the Government Accountability Office to call the tracking system itself illogical, inaccurate, and unexplainable. The fund expired in the fall of 2025. It has not been renewed. What does $24 billion of deferred maintenance look like at the Grand Canyon? It looks like crumbling roadways built for traffic volumes that were surpassed decades ago. It looks like weakened roofs and moldy walls in employee housing, trailers from the 1950s and 1960s that seasonal workers live in because there is nothing else. It looks like storm-damaged docks and faded safety signage on trails where a wrong step means a 1,000-foot fall. It looks like wastewater systems across the park system facing $270 million in overdue work. Systems where a failure doesn't just smell bad, it contaminates a watershed. At the Grand Canyon, it looks like a restaurant where meals are served on paper plates with plastic utensils during water restrictions, because there isn't enough pressure in the system to wash dishes. And most of all, it looks like a pipeline. The Trans-Canyon Water Line is a 12.5-mile pipe that runs from Roaring Springs below the North Rim, down across the Inner Canyon, under the Colorado River, and up to Grand Canyon Village on the South Rim. It is the sole water supply for every hotel, restaurant, campground, fire hydrant, and drinking fountain that serves the busiest part of the busiest side of one of the most visited national parks in America. It was finished in 1970. It was designed to last 30 years. It is still in service. Since 2010, it has broken more than 85 times. The breaks come from rock falls, flash floods, freeze-thaw cycles, and simple age. When the pipeline breaks, the consequences cascade immediately. Hotels shut down, showers are restricted, water fountains on trails go dry. Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the canyon closes its overnight accommodations, and the park's fire suppression capacity is dangerously reduced. In one incident, the park came within hours of closing entirely. Maintenance crews, described by one park official as Wonder Women and Wonder Men, locate the breaks, helicopter in replacement sections, and patch the line, sometimes in 100-degree heat at the bottom of a mile-deep canyon. They have done this more than 85 times in 14 years. A long-term replacement, budgeted at $208 million, has been in planning for decades and is expected to be completed around 2027. The pipeline's 30-year design life expired in the year 2000. The pipeline is invisible. Visitors never see it. They see the water coming out of a faucet at the El Tovar, and they have no idea that the faucet is connected to a 55-year-old pipe that has broken 85 times, held together by patches and helicopter runs, and the sheer stubbornness of a maintenance crew that refuses to let the system fail. This is the Grand Canyon's real story, the one that no postcard shows. the enormous, fragile, aging infrastructure that makes it possible for 5 million people a year to stand at the rim and feel awe. The awe is natural. Everything else is engineering, and the engineering is falling apart. The Concession story is its own kind of slow-motion catastrophe. Xanterra Parks and Resorts, whose corporate ancestors have operated South Rim hotels and restaurants since the Fred Harvey days, invested roughly $200 million in improvements over its decades of operation. Under federal law, any company that wins the concession contract must reimburse the outgoing operator for those improvements. The result was a catch-22. The contract generated over $1 billion in revenue over its term, but the $200 million reimbursement requirement scared off every potential competitor. The Park Service tried 3 times to find a bidder other than Xanterra. Each time, nobody came. Finally, in 2014, the Park Service agreed to use $100 million, drawn partly from fee revenues at 88 other national parks, to buy down the debt, reducing the barrier for competing companies. 88 parks paid for one park's concession problem. The contract still went to Xanterra. Meanwhile, on the North Rim, the concession story took a different path. The operation was smaller. The North Rim draws only about 10% of the Grand Canyon's visitors. And the contract bounced between operators, from the Utah Parks Company to AmFac to Xanterra to Forever Resorts and finally to Aramark, each inheriting aging cabins and a short operating season that ran only from mid-May to mid-October. The estimated annual revenue was $17 to $19 million, roughly half from lodging. The National Park Service was in the process of soliciting new proposals for the North Rim concession when the Dragon Bravo fire made the question moot. There is no lodge to operate. There are no cabins to fill. The fire arrived at a moment when the Grand Canyon was already under extraordinary strain from a direction nobody had anticipated. In January 2025, the Department of Government Efficiency initiated a campaign of buyouts, early retirements, and firings across the federal workforce. The National Park Service, which employed roughly 20,000 people, lost approximately 4,000 permanent staff, 24% of its permanent workforce, by the summer of 2025. About 1,000 probationary employees were dismissed in a single day in February, in what park employees came to call the Valentine's Day Massacre. A hiring freeze delayed seasonal staffing, so that parks entered the busiest months of the year without their full complement of rangers, maintenance workers, and visitor services staff. The proposed fiscal year 2026 budget included an $897 million cut to park management, the largest cut in the 109-year history of the National Park Service. Congress ultimately rejected the full cut, but flat funding still left the agency operating well below pre-2025 levels. The 43-day government shutdown, the longest in history, had further strained the system. Parks remained technically open during the shutdown, but operated with skeletal crews, limited services, and no fee collection. Bathrooms went uncleaned. Trash piled up. Visitors who arrived expecting a national park found something closer to an unstaffed roadside pull-off with a very good view. When the shutdown ended and the bills came due, the park system was already deep in a hole. At the Grand Canyon specifically, the effects were both visible and invisible. Visible: fewer rangers at overlooks, longer lines at entrance stations, reduced hours at visitor centers, overflowing trash cans on peak weekends. Invisible: fewer people monitoring trail conditions, slower response to pipeline breaks, deferred inspections of aging structures, thinner wildfire suppression crews heading into fire season. The Grand Canyon had always run lean. Now it was running on fumes. And then it was July, and the lightning struck, and the Dragon Bravo fire was running through the ponderosa pine forest of the North Rim at a pace that made experienced firefighters use words like extreme and volatile. The historic Grand Canyon Lodge, with its kaibab limestone walls and its sunroom and its 88 years of guests singing farewell songs in the evening burned on July 13th. The wastewater treatment plant was destroyed, causing a chlorine gas leak that forced firefighters themselves to evacuate. Aramark, the concession operator, got all employees and guests out safely. 200 workers lost their housing. Families who had booked North Rim vacations a year in advance, some who had waited years for the chance, saw their trips erased in an afternoon. It is worth pausing on one detail. The Grand Canyon Lodge was a National Historic Landmark, designated in 1987. It sat at Bright Angel Point, one of the most spectacular overlooks in the American West. Its sunroom was, in the estimation of many visitors, the single most beautiful interior space in the entire national park system. A room where massive windows dissolved the wall between inside and outside, where you sat in a chair and the canyon opened in front of you as if the building were a frame and the landscape were the painting. Visitors came back year after year to sit in that room. They wrote about it, photographed it, proposed in it, mourned in it. The National Park Service's website for the lodge, as of 2026, still shows images of the building and the room, even though the building no longer exists. Plans to rebuild will go through a public review and environmental planning process. No timeline has been given. When the North Rim reopened on May 15, 2026, the park announced that visitors should approach the season with a mindset of flexibility and complete self-reliance. The paved roads were open, the viewpoints were accessible. The North Kaibab Trail, the main route into the inner canyon from the North Rim, was open for foot traffic. But there was no potable water anywhere on the North Rim. Visitors had to bring every drop they would need for their entire stay. There was no lodging inside the park, no visitor center, no dining, no gift shop. The closest accommodation was Kaibab Lodge, 5 miles north of the entrance station. The park's guiding principle for the season was a sentence that tells you everything. We will open what we can, where we can, when we can. Consider the arc of the Grand Canyon Railway, the original Santa Fe spur line from Williams. The railroad that had invented Grand Canyon tourism stopped running passenger service in 1968, a victim of the automobile and the interstate highway system. The depot on the South Rim, a beautiful log and stone building, sat empty. For 20 years, nobody rode the train to the Grand Canyon. Then, in 1989, a group of investors revived the line as a tourist railroad, running vintage cars on the 65-mile route. It became one of the most successful heritage railways in the country, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers a year and taking several thousand cars off the road into the park, a partial solution to the parking nightmare that has defined the South Rim experience for decades. There is something almost too neat about it. The railroad that opened the Grand Canyon to tourism in 1901, abandoned in 1968, revived in 1989, now running again, while the lodge that its rival railroad built on the North Rim lies in ashes. The South Rim, of course, remains fully operational. The El Tovar still stands, still serves dinner on white tablecloths, still charges north of $500 a night for rooms that book out months in advance. Mary Colter's buildings still receive visitors. Hopi House still sells Native American crafts. Lookout Studio still juts over the rim. Phantom Ranch still welcomes lottery winners at the bottom of the canyon. In 2024, the Grand Canyon received 4.92 million visitors who spent a combined $905 million. The South Rim parking lots still fill by late morning in summer. The shuttle buses still run. The mule trains still descend Bright Angel Trail. The place functions. But functioning and thriving are different things. The 4.92 million visitors in 2024 represented a 4% decline from the prior year and remained 17% below the pre-pandemic peak. In 2025, the Grand Canyon dropped from 3rd to 4th among the most visited national parks, behind Great Smoky Mountains, the Blue Ridge Parkway, and Yellowstone. The first time in memory that Yellowstone outranked it. The cause was partly the North Rim closure, partly the government shutdown that stretched 43 days, and partly something harder to measure, a growing sense among the Americans who love these places most that the parks are being allowed to decay. In 2022, the park quietly renamed one of its most popular inner canyon landmarks. Indian Garden, a lush oasis and campground 4.5 miles down the Bright Angel Trail, became Havasupai Gardens, honoring the Havasupai people who had lived there, farmed there, and been forcibly removed from there in 1926 so the Park Service could develop the area for tourists. The Havasupai had irrigated crops in that garden for centuries before any white person saw the canyon. The renaming took 96 years. New signage went up. The campground is otherwise unchanged. The water that irrigates it comes from the same pipeline that keeps breaking. The heat death statistics tell their own story. Between 2007 and 2025, 225 people died in Grand Canyon National Park, an average of about 17 per year. The leading causes were not the dramatic cliff falls that dominate the public imagination, but medical events, heat stroke, cardiac arrest, dehydration, hypothermia. Inner canyon temperatures regularly exceed 109 degrees in summer. A National Park Service study projected that heat-related illness at the Grand Canyon could increase by up to 137% under climate change scenarios, producing as many as 254 heat-related illnesses per year during peak season. In June 2026, 3 hikers died of apparent heat-related causes in the Inner Canyon within a single week. The park posted advisories urging visitors to stay off Inner Canyon trails between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Whether there were enough rangers on duty to enforce that guidance is an open question. There is a photograph from October 2025 taken by the National Park Service that shows the Grand Canyon Lodge after the fire. The sunroom's great windows are gone. The roof is gone. What remains is a row of stone pillars and standing metal beams silhouetted against the canyon beyond. The framing is almost identical to the view that Underwood designed in 1937. The same angle on the same abyss, except that now there is no glass, no roof, no room. The building has become a ruin, and through the ruin, the canyon is visible in exactly the way it always was. Indifferent, enormous, older than anything humans have ever built or will ever build. In November 2025, demolition crews removed the remaining unstable walls. By the time they finished, the site was bare stone and charred earth. The view from Bright Angel Point remained unchanged. The canyon does not notice the absence of a lodge any more than it noticed its presence. It is visitors who notice. It is visitors who drove 210 miles from Las Vegas, or flew from Chicago, or saved for 3 years for the trip they would take after retirement, who pull into the North Rim and find a parking lot where a lodge used to be, and a sign explaining that water is not available. The Grand Canyon is not dying. It is not even declining exactly, if you define decline purely by the number of bodies passing through the entrance gates. Nearly 5 million people still visit every year. They still gasp at the rim. They still take the photograph. Many of them have a wonderful time. But what is dying, or at least what is being allowed to die, is the infrastructure of experience, the buildings, the pipes, the trails, the staff, the accumulated investment of a century that transformed a geological spectacle into a place where ordinary Americans could have an extraordinary encounter with their own country. The Trans-Canyon Pipeline, built in 1970, designed for 30 years, patched 85 times, still carrying water to 5 million visitors a year, because nobody funded a replacement for 2.5 decades. The Grand Canyon Lodge, built in 1928, burned in 1932, rebuilt in 1937, burned again in 2025, with no timeline to rebuild. The Park Service workforce cut by a quarter in a single year, entering fire season short-staffed and entering the busiest summer in memory with fewer rangers than at any point in a generation. The maintenance backlog, growing by billions, tracked by a system the government's own auditors call illogical. The concession contracts, so tangled in legacy obligations that 88 parks had to subsidize one park's operating deal. Mary Colter designed buildings to disappear into the landscape. She wanted visitors to see the canyon, not the architecture. She succeeded so completely that generations of Americans took her buildings for granted, assumed they were natural features, assumed they would always be there, assumed someone was taking care of them. The same assumption extended to everything else: the water, the trails, the rangers, the fire crews. The assumption that someone, somewhere, was keeping the lights on. The Fred Harvey Company used to have a tradition at the Grand Canyon Lodge on the North Rim. When guests arrived, the staff lined up at the door to welcome them. When guests departed, the staff lined up again and sang a song, a farewell, a send-off, a small ceremony that said, "You were here, and we were glad." They called it the Sing-Away. It happened every evening for years, starting in 1928. The tradition survived the first fire, it survived the Depression and the war and the automobile age and the era of budget airlines and Instagram tourism. It did not survive the Dragon Bravo fire. On the South Rim, the El Tovar is undergoing a room refresh in the summer of 2026. Portions of the hotel will be closed from July through September while contractors update the guest rooms. The dining room will remain open. The views from the terrace will remain available. You can still stand on the spot where Theodore Roosevelt stood in 1903 and look out at a canyon that is 277 miles long and 18 miles wide and 1 mile deep and does not, has never, will never care whether anyone is watching. What it cannot do is pour you a glass of water from a 55-year-old pipe. What it cannot do is hand you a room key at a lodge that no longer exists. What it cannot do is send a ranger to check on you when you're 2 miles down a trail in 112-degree heat and your legs have stopped working. Those are human things. Those require money and maintenance and people and decisions made by other people in offices 1,000 miles from the rim. The canyon is an act of geology. The experience of visiting the canyon is an act of government. And government, it turns out, is the thing that burns. The sunroom at the Grand Canyon Lodge was 50 feet long. The windows ran floor to ceiling. In the morning, the canyon filled with light from the east, and the limestone walls of the room turned the color of honey. In the evening, the shadows climbed the far wall of the canyon, the south rim 9 miles away, and the whole space went from gold to rose to violet, while guests sat in wooden rocking chairs and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Underwood designed the room in 1936. Colter would have understood exactly what he was doing. You build the frame. You let the emptiness do the work. The frame is gone now. The emptiness remains.